In 1979, the Soviet Union sent its army into Afghanistan, believing the mission would be quick and easy, but instead it became a long and painful war that slowly drained Soviet power and confidence. Soviet troops crossed the border, removed Afghanistan's communist leader, and replaced him with Babrak Karmal, a man loyal to Moscow, hoping this change would stabilize the country and secure a friendly government in Kabul. Yet while the government managed to control major cities, especially the capital, most of the countryside remained in the hands of Islamic fighters known as the mujahadeen, who strongly opposed communism and foreign occupation and were deeply connected to the land, villages, and local population. Karmal promised democracy, political freedom, and respect for Islam, but at the same time his government created a powerful secret police force that arrested, tortured, and silenced critics, spreading fear across Afghan society and quickly destroying trust in the new regime. Anger grew rapidly, and protests broke out in cities like Kandahar, Herat, and Kabul. And in 1980, when large crowds marched against the government in the capital, Soviet troops were called in and opened fire, killing many civilians and turning public frustration into open rebellion. Inside the Soviet Union, leaders argued over whether to leave Afghanistan or stay, but they feared withdrawal would make the country appear weak during the Cold War, so they decided to remain and sent the 40th Army, made up mostly of young and inexperienced soldiers, to secure roads, supply routes, and key locations across Afghanistan's mountains and deserts. These soldiers had been trained for large conventional wars in Europe, not for guerrilla fighting against small mobile groups who attacked suddenly and vanished into difficult terrain. And very soon they found themselves facing constant ambushes, surprise attacks, and an enemy that blended into the civilian population. The mujahadeen were not a single united force, but rather many different groups with different leaders and ideas. Yet they shared a common goal of forcing the Soviets out of Afghanistan, and their resistance was strengthened when foreign powers became involved and turned the war into an important battlefield of the Cold War. Pakistan played a major role by controlling supply routes and refugee camps, while its intelligence service decided which Afghan groups would receive help. And countries like the United States, Saudi Arabia, China, Egypt, and Britain provided money, weapons, and support to weaken Soviet influence. As the war continued, certain resistance leaders became well known, especially Ahmad Shah Massoud, who fought in the Panjshir Valley and proved difficult to defeat despite repeated Soviet attacks using tanks, aircraft, and helicopters, showing that superior technology alone could not overcome fighters who knew the land and had local support. At the same time, the Afghan government army began to fall apart due to poor training, low morale, political divisions, and widespread desertions, with many soldiers abandoning their posts and some even joining the resistance while taking weapons with them. Soviet troops faced not only combat but also severe hardship, as many bases lacked clean water, proper shelter, and adequate medical care, leading to widespread disease and exhaustion, and hospitals were overwhelmed by sick and wounded soldiers. Many Soviet soldiers returned home physically injured or emotionally broken, carrying deep anger and confusion about why they had been sent to fight in a distant land for unclear goals. As the conflict dragged on, violence increased on all sides, and entire villages were bombed, fields were destroyed, civilians were forced from their homes, and medical aid was sometimes denied as a way to pressure communities, which caused massive suffering among ordinary Afghans who had little control over the war around them. By the early 1980s, millions of Afghans had fled the country, becoming refugees in Pakistan and Iran, where families lived in crowded camps under difficult conditions, and women and children often suffered the most, facing poverty, injury, and loss of education. Instead of weakening the resistance, harsh Soviet tactics often strengthened it, as anger against foreign troops grew and more people were willing to support the mujahideen, especially as foreign aid increased during the mid-1980s and provided the fighters with better weapons and supplies. Inside the Soviet Union, leadership changed several times, and each new leader approved stronger military actions in hopes of forcing a victory, but none succeeded in ending the conflict, and international criticism of Soviet actions continued to grow. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the new Soviet leader and quickly understood that the war in Afghanistan could not be won and was damaging the Soviet economy, military, and society. Yet before leaving, he approved one final attempt to turn the situation around by increasing special forces operations and launching major offensives. These final efforts led to heavy fighting, especially in eastern Afghanistan, but once again the mujahadeen survived, protected by their mountain bases, underground tunnels, and continued foreign support. After years of fighting, it became clear that the Soviet Union could win battles but not the war. As the resistance remained active, the Afghan government lacked popular support and the country lay in ruins. By the mid-1980s, Afghanistan was devastated, millions of people were displaced, entire regions were destroyed, and the conflict had become a symbol of exhaustion rather than victory. The Soviet-Afghan War was not decided by one great battle, but by years of constant struggle that slowly wore down the Soviet leadership and forced them to accept the limits of their power, proving to the world that even a superpower can fail when it fights a determined population on its own land.